Welcome to Netherreglai Jewish Ministries, where we teach the Bible from a Jewish historical, cultural, and linguistic perspective. Today's teaching is on Revelation chapter 12, verses 13 to 17. And I've titled this teaching, The War with the Saints. Now, as always, we want to look at the context of this chapter. We looked at it in great detail in the last teaching, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. But we see how Revelation 12 starts the second half of the book of Revelation, right? We finished the first 11 chapters, and now we're going into the second or the final 11 chapters. Now, we also see a unique focus in Revelation chapters 4 to 11, which all deal with the end time scenario, but it's mainly focusing on the acts of God in chapters 4 to 11, whereas in Revelation chapters 12 and 13, we see an emphasis or a focus on the acts of Satan. And again, as I said last time, it's not black and white, but the majority of the actions that are being described in these chapters 12 and 13 are the acts of Satan. And it's important to understand that in its context. Now, we also know that chapters 12 and 13 and 14 are part of this third interlude. And now, just as in the prior two interludes, the third interlude provides more information. And we looked at that in great detail as well last time. Now, in chapter 12, we see these two signs in heaven, right? The one is the woman with child with the sun, moon, and stars, and the other is the dragon with the 7 heads, 10 horns, and 7 crowns. Now, we also see these 4 main symbolic characters in Revelation chapter 12, the woman, the dragon, the male child, and the other children of the woman. And that's kind of the main focus of this teaching, or the end of this teaching. Now, we also have the name characters, right? The archangel Michael, the angels and demons, and God and Satan, right? They're clearly spoken of in this chapter. Now, I put together this timeline just to kind of understand what's written in Revelation chapter 12 and to understand it from a kind of a time perspective, right? So we have these main figures, the dragon, the woman, and the male child, and we know that they represent Satan, Israel, and the Messiah. And as we see the references that go back in time, right? We have Satan, who's the dragon, but he's also called that serpent of old, right? Bringing us back to Genesis 3, as we see on the left of this timeline. And then we have Israel, who is this woman clothed with the sun, moon, and stars. And again, that's a reference going back to the nation of Israel in Genesis 37, right? And then we have the Messiah, the male child, whom Satan wants to devour at his birth. And we see how that's fulfilled in Matthew chapter 2. And then we're moving on. Then we come to the middle of the chapter in verses 7 and 8. We read about this war in heaven between Satan and his angels and the archangel Michael and his angels. And we see how that's something that actually kind of transcends time. It's continuous. It's always going on, this war in heaven. We made reference to this last time in Daniel 10 and other scriptures, right? There's always this war in heaven, right? But then we see at the end that it will come to an end, right? Satan and his angels are thrown down to the earth during the time of the Great Tribulation, right? At the beginning of that Great Tribulation. And that takes us to where we come in this chapter. And we see these two themes of Revelation chapter 12, right? As I have written on the timeline here, the top one being the spiritual warfare from the Garden of Eden to the end times. And then we had this other theme in Revelation 12, this war in heaven, which comes to earth at the Great Tribulation, right? And this is kind of my perspective of as I see chapter 12 being unfolded for us, kind of in a timeline perspective along with these two themes. Okay, so let's get right into the text. Now, we read verses 7 to 12 last time. We ended with them, but I want to just read them again and then continue in the text of the last 5 verses, verses 13 to 17. So we read this in Revelation 12, beginning in verse 7. And there was war in heaven, Michael and his angels waging war with the dragon. The dragon and his angels waged war, and they did not prevail. And there was no longer a place found for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who was called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah have come. For the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down, he who accuses them before our God day and night. And they overcame him because of the blood of the Lamb and because of the word of their testimony. And they did not love their life even when faced with death. For this reason, rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, knowing that he has only a short time. So this is where we ended in the last teaching. And I taught in that teaching that the short time referenced here that is given to Satan to unleash his wrath on the earth, right? When he is thrown down to the earth and he will unleash his wrath, is for the 3.5 years of the Great Tribulation. And I just mentioned that, we see this later in the scripture. Now, what is the basis for that? It's actually in the next verses here in context, right? So let's continue in this chapter, verses 13 to 17, where we read this. And when the dragon saw that he was thrown down to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. But the 2 wings of the great eagle were given to the woman so that she could fly into the wilderness to her place where she was nourished for a time and times and half a time from the presence of the serpent. And the serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth after the woman, so that he might cause her to be swept away with the flood. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and drank up the river which the dragon poured out of his mouth. So the dragon was enraged with the woman and went off to make war with the rest of her children, who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Yeshua. And that brings the chapter to an end. Now, the reaction of the dragon or Satan to his being thrown down to the earth will be to persecute the woman, Israel, and the rest of her children, as we read here at the end of this chapter. And the time frame given to us in verse 14 is for a time and times and half a time. And that is 3.5 years. We've seen this expression many times before, right? So the 3.5 years of the Great Tribulation is when Satan will unleash his wrath on the earth, according to this context, right, in these scriptures. Now, we also read here clearly that the devil will unleash his wrath, right, at this time. That is what he will do. And he will do it in an intense way because his time is short. And I just want to emphasize here an important fact that we see in Scripture, that the earth will simultaneously witness the wrath of God and the wrath of Satan during the Great Tribulation. I often hear taught in Christian circles from pastors and Bible teachers regarding the fact that believers can't be on the earth during the Great Tribulation because God's pouring his wrath out on the unbelievers. And I think that's a misunderstanding, or it's only half the story. It's actually the wrath of Satan that's being unleashed for these 3.5 years. And it's when he's thrown down to the earth with his angels. And we also see God's wrath being directed towards those who take the mark of the beast. There's some general plagues that are thrown to the earth, right? But there's also specific ones that target those who follow Satan and take the mark of the beast. The point is simply to understand that there's the simultaneous, the spiritual warfare comes to earth, right? Satan's thrown down to the earth with his angels, and the spiritual warfare will be intense on earth at that time for the Great Tribulation. That's why we read about the severity of the situation on earth at that time. It is going to be an intense spiritual warfare. That which was in heaven, the spiritual warfare that's always going on, will come to earth. So it's something like we've never seen before. So again, it's important to understand that those 3.5 years of the Great Tribulation are literally given to Satan. Satan's power will be manifested in the final earthly kingdom and the Antichrist, right? He gives his power to the final earthly ruler and that kingdom. We read this in Daniel 7:23-25 as well, where we read this. Thus he said, the fourth beast will be a fourth kingdom on the earth, which will be different from all the other kingdoms, and will devour the whole earth, and tread it down, and crush it. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings will arise, and another will arise after them, and he will be different from the previous ones, and will subdue 3 kings. He will speak out against the Most High and wear down the saints of the Highest One, and he will intend to make alterations in times and in law, and they will be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. Right? So we see this authority being given into his hand for this period, right? Power and authority are given to the evil one, given to the Antichrist during this time. The Antichrist will blaspheme God and persecute the saints for this time. Satan will unleash his wrath on the earth during this time of the Great Tribulation. It's important to understand what's going on the other side, on the satanic side, on the evil side. In Daniel 7:23-25, we read that the Antichrist will be given authority from Satan during the time of the Great Tribulation, and the Antichrist will focus on 3 things. He will speak out against the Most High, right, on God himself. He will wear down the saints of the Highest One, and he will intend to make alterations in time and law. This is the activity, the main activity of Satan during that time. The reign of the Antichrist will be a living hell on earth, especially for those who believe in God and his Messiah. They're going to be targeted, right? That's what we read in these scriptures. The spiritual weapon for believers at that time is the same as it is today, and they overcame him because of the blood of the Lamb and because of the word of their testimony, and they did not love their life even when faced with death. Our promise from God is not that our physical bodies will be preserved forever, right? We are promised eternal life with God in new bodies. We are guaranteed to be persecuted and to suffer in this world. That's part of the calling, taking his name upon ourselves, right? Just as he would suffer, we would suffer. We'd be persecuted as he was persecuted, right? There's unfortunately other teachings out there that want to say, if you believe in Yeshua and Jesus, then, you have all of these blessings, and they focus on that you won't be persecuted or different things, right? That's not the case. We are promised that we will be persecuted, and our weapon is to proclaim Yeshua for who he is. He is the Messiah, and we proclaim his blood, right? It's only by his blood that we are cleansed. Now, from Revelation chapter 12, verse 1 until the end of the chapter, we see how Satan seeks to persecute the people of God throughout history until the end, right? It goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. Before Adam and Eve even fell, right? Satan deceived them through the serpent. And he continues until the end, as we read about it in Revelation, about the end times. Now, Revelation chapter 12, verse 13 picks up the prophetic narrative from where it left off in verse 6, when the dragon sought to destroy the male child, right? When he sought to destroy the Messiah. And we read this in Revelation 12:13. And when the dragon saw that he was thrown down to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child, right? So we see that connection again with the object of the dragon is to destroy the male child, right? That promised seed of the woman who is to be the Messiah. Now, since the dragon was not successful in destroying the male child, the Messiah, the dragon pursues the woman, the nation of Israel, with a vengeance. The spiritual battle and persecution against the nation of Israel, the Jewish people, has continued ever since God chose Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, most Christians, believers, right, believers in Yeshua, understand the root of this evil intent by Satan to destroy right? God's people, but certainly not all. And I mentioned here, for example, people who believe in replacement theology, right? They believe that the quote unquote church has replaced Israel, and they just want to take all the blessings of Israel for themselves, and they kind of just think Israel and the Jewish people are irrelevant, right? So there's that thinking, and they don't understand the real spiritual warfare that has continued in the beginning and that started in the beginning and continues until the end regarding the nation of Israel and the Jewish people. Now, the biblical and spiritual basis of this satanic strategy to destroy the people of God, together with God's plan of salvation, is vital to having a balanced perspective on the Bible. Now, it's better to understand this. In order to better understand the subject, I want to quote Dr. John Wavard, who comments on these verses in particular and provides a broader perspective of how Jewish persecution is satanic at its core. And it's important to understand this principle. And Dr. Wavard says this: the persecution of Israel is part of the satanic program to thwart and hinder the work of God. As far as Israel is concerned, this had its beginning in the miraculous intervention of God required to bring about the birth of Isaac and fulfill this portion of the promise to Abraham. Satan used other means thereafter to persecute the descendants of Jacob, including the effort in the time of Esther to blot them out completely. Israel is hated by Satan not because of any of its own characteristics, but because she is the chosen of God and essential to the overall purpose of God for time and eternity. Well worded by Dr. Wavard here, right? We need to understand Israel's place, right? The nation of Israel in God's plan of salvation, not only to bring about the Messiah, but also in the end times, because it carries through. And we're seeing that here in Revelation 12, right? It is a result of this divine plan of God to use the nation of Israel for his eternal purposes that Satan, the dragon, seeks to persecute Israel, the woman, and to devour the Messiah, her male child. We've already seen this played out in Revelation 12. Right now, having failed to destroy the Messiah, Satan continues to persecute the nation of Israel up to today and will continue until the very end. So a couple of questions to think about. Is Satan's persecution only against Israel? Will he only target the Jewish people? I think the answer is in our text here, and I want us just to have those questions in mind as we find the answer. Now, in verse 14, we read about a certain place of refuge in the wilderness provided for Israel, for the woman. Again, to read verse 14, but the two wings of the great eagle were given to the woman so that she could fly into the wilderness to her place where she was nourished for a time and times and half a time from the presence of the serpent. Now, this verse is actually very similar to verse 6. Just to read verse 6 again, where we read, then the woman fled into the wilderness where she had a place prepared by God, so that there she would be nourished for 1,260 days, right? And I've explained this many times, but again, just to understand that the 1,260 days, 42 months, and 3.5 years, times and half a time, right? They're all speaking of that same period of the Great Tribulation. And again, we've seen this both in the books of Daniel and Revelation. And interesting, in these two verses, in Revelation 12:6 and Revelation 12:14, we read about this place as being a place of nourishment. Now, there will be some type of refuge that God will make available to Israel during the time of the Great Tribulation. It appears to be a literal place of protection and nourishment, right? Nourishment and food. Now, we also read about these two wings of the great eagle, which are given to the woman so that she could fly into the wilderness to her place. So what does this mean, right? What will this look like? Are the wings of the great eagle literal or just symbolic? Will Israel fly in airplanes to a place of refuge when the Great Tribulation begins? What do the two wings of the great eagle mean? Now, no one knows exactly, right? We can read this amazing illustration, this metaphor, this prophetic word in Revelation 12. We need to do our best to interpret it, to understand it. The two wings of the great eagle appear to be symbolic, as explained here by Dr. Walvard. He says, quote, the figure of the two wings of the great eagle seems to be derived from Exodus 19:4, Deuteronomy 32:11-12, and similar passages where God uses the strength of an eagle to illustrate his faithfulness in caring for Israel. And I think this is probably true. I think this is a good explanation of how to understand this. And just to better understand that, right? In Exodus 19:4, that's when the children of Israel had just come out of Egypt, right? And as they were in the desert, God spoke these words through Moses to the children of Israel. And here's Exodus 19:4. God said, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now we know in the Exodus story, the children of Israel didn't fly out on eagle's wings, right? God brought them out by his powerful hand, right? He delivered them. And by the blood of the Lamb, they were set free, right, from that, and they were brought into the promised land. But that illustration of the great eagle is simply God's power, right? And it's expressed in that picture of the eagle's wings. Although the wings of an eagle appear to be symbolic, they point to a supernatural provision of God in whatever way they will be manifested, right? We don't know how it will actually manifest itself, but it's simply illustrating God's power in some way to bring his people to a place of refuge. So what do we know about this place of refuge, which is spoken about here in Revelation 12? Who will escape to this place of refuge? Where will this place be located, which God will prepare for Israel? How will God nourish Israel for this period of time? So it's good to think about these questions. A couple things we know. The Greek word for being nourished that's used both in verse 6 and verse 14 is trepho, and simply means to nourish or to feed. It's used in a very literal way in the scriptures. The general use of trepho assumes that physical provisions such as food and water will be provided to Israel at this place of refuge in those days. Now, we also read about the wilderness. This place is described as in the wilderness, right? And just to say that Greek word there is eremos, meaning solitary, desolate, desert wilderness. It's generally used for the desert land, right? So where will this wilderness refuge be located? We're not given an exact location, therefore we can only speculate regarding where this place of refuge will be located. There are, however, a few clues in Scripture, and I want to point them out. So in Matthew chapter 24, Yeshua gave the following advice to his disciples. This is in the context of the Great Tribulation, right? He says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. So when the Great Tribulation begins, Yeshua stated that it is best to not stay in Judea, but rather he advised to flee to the mountains. So we know it's in the wilderness. So which mountains in the wilderness is Yeshua referring to? Another detail we find in the book of Daniel regarding the end times is that there will be a certain area of the earth which will not be conquered or controlled by the Antichrist. And we read about this in Daniel 11:41, where we read this. He will also enter the beautiful land, referring to Israel, and many countries will fall, but these will be rescued out of his hand, Edom, Moab, and the foremost of the sons of Ammon, right? So where are Edom, Moab, and Ammon today? They are basically east and maybe south of Jerusalem and Judea, right? It's basically the country of Jordan, right? This is all that area on the other side of the Jordan River. So these three biblical nations or territories, Edom, Moab, and Ammon, lie east of Jerusalem, east of Judea, and are prophesied to be left unharmed by the Antichrist. So it's possible that this is the place where the refuge will be. So I just summarize here by saying that the Bible provides strong evidence that this place of refuge will be in the wilderness mountains of the country of Jordan. Putting all those biblical truths together, the things that we know, it's possible. Now, there's even some speculation that it will be in the area of Petra, which is in Jordan, based on verses in Isaiah 33, 13 to 16. And again, this is in the same area, so it all makes sense. And whether it's just that area in Petra or all somewhere else in that area of Jordan is yet to be seen. Now, who will flee to the wilderness refuge? So from the scriptures, we are told that it will be the woman, meaning people from the nation of Israel who will flee to this refuge. Now, as we see in the Exodus story, when the children of Israel came out of Egypt, it was not simply the nation of Israel. We read that in Exodus 12:38, it was a mixed multitude, right? A mixed multitude also went up with them, right? And you can look at that in context. But we know that there were others from Egypt and maybe other countries, people that were in Egypt, that went out with the nation of Israel, right? They identified with the nation of Israel. So this may be the same thing that will happen in the end times when the Jewish people flee to this place of refuge, that a mixed multitude may go with them. Now, we're not given exact numbers regarding how many people will flee to this place of refuge. However, a prophecy in Zechariah that corresponds to the end times provides more details. So I want to read this scripture in Zechariah 14, 1-2, where we read, "Behold, a day is coming for the Lord when the spoil taken from you will be divided among you. For I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city will be captured, the houses plundered, the women ravished, and half of the city exiled. But the rest of the people will not be cut off from the city." So these verses in Zechariah 14 clearly correspond to the time of the Great Tribulation with a focus on the nations against Jerusalem. We read in these verses that half of the city will be exiled or will go out into exile. So it may be these people who flee to the place of refuge, right? They go out of the city into exile to the place of refuge. Now, what does it mean that half of the city of Jerusalem will leave the city and go into exile as far as numbers? So just to give an understanding of, Jerusalem today, the population of Jerusalem today is about 1 million people. I think maybe a little bit shy of that, maybe 900,000. But it doesn't matter. Therefore, if these events occurred today, about 500,000 people, 500,000 people would go out and flee to this place of refuge. So I just mentioned here how the irony of the Jews fleeing to the east, Arab, Muslim areas, and not to the west, right, to Europe and America, to the Christian areas, as we call them, would have been unthinkable up until recently, right? The countries in the Middle East and to the east have always been, enemies of Israel. But, interestingly enough, just 3 years ago in 2020, we had these signing of the Abraham Accords with all these different Arab Muslim nations that are making peace with Israel, right? And Jordan and Israel have had a long-standing peace agreement, as well as Israel and Egypt. Now, we then read about a unique attempt by Satan to destroy the woman Israel as she flees away, as we continue in Revelation 12, verses 15-16. We read this in these verses. "And the serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth after the woman, so that he might cause her to be swept away with the flood. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and drank up the river which the dragon poured out of his mouth." Such an interesting description, right? The dragon or serpent attempts to destroy the woman, the nation of Israel, by causing a flood of water to be released after her. However, the earth helps her and swallows the water, right? Opens up and swallows the water. Now, why the change in the text from the dragon to the serpent and back to the dragon? I don't know if you caught that as we have been reading these scriptures, but just to put those verses up again, we see how it starts with the serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth, and it ends with the river which the dragon poured out of his mouth. So why does it go from the serpent to the dragon and back to the serpent? So we see the word serpent used 3 times in Revelation chapter 12, verses 9, 14, and 15, just to kind of highlight it here for us on the screen, right? So we go from the great dragon to the serpent of old, to the serpent, and then back to the dragon. So why do we see the back and forth? We know it's speaking of Satan in all of these instances, right? And I think, again, it's just to emphasize the 2 themes of Revelation 12. It's that spiritual warfare that has continued from the beginning when the serpent appeared in the garden, back in the Garden of Eden, and it continues until the end times, right? It's the same evil force, Satan, from the Garden of Eden until the end times. And also how that war in heaven comes to the earth in the end times. And I think it's just emphasizing Satan's character, who he is, that deceiver, that deceptive serpent of old, right? Now, what are we to understand from these verses 15 and 16 about this kind of crazy story, right? The woman flees to the place of refuge from the presence of the serpent. The serpent or the dragon opens its mouth and sends a flood of water to destroy her. The earth helps the woman by swallowing up the water. How do we interpret this scenario? Now, although this prophecy is highly symbolic, I take it at face value. Basically, there's going to be an attempt by Satan to destroy the Jewish people who will flee to this place of refuge at that time, but he will fail. So whether or not there will be a flood of water is yet to be seen. Whether that's simply an illustration or if it will really be water. I think the main point is that he will seek to destroy the Jewish people, the people of Israel, those who are fleeing to this place of refuge, right? I think we have to understand the bigger point being made through this illustration. So a couple more questions to think about. Where are believers during these days? Will only the people of Israel be persecuted at that time? And we keep talking about the woman and the nation of Israel. What about believers in Jesus? Where are they, right? What is the situation during the time of the Great Tribulation? Well, then we come to the final verse of Revelation chapter 12, and we're coming to an end of this teaching, right? So again, to read Revelation 12:17. So the dragon was enraged with the woman and went off to make war with the rest of her children who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Yeshua. So I just want to mention here that in the most ancient Greek text, the first phrase of 13:1 is best related contextually to the dragon, where we have this phrase, and he stood on the sand of the seashore, right? So depending on your translation, you may have it at the end here of verse 17, or it may be the beginning of verse 13. It doesn't matter. Chapters and verses are man-made, right? But just to say contextually, it fits well with the end of chapter 12 here, the verse 17, because it's talking about the dragon stood on the sand of the seashore. We'll talk more about this when we get to chapter 13, but just to mention that. Okay, so again, verse 17 here, so the dragon was enraged with the woman and went off to make war with the rest of her children who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Yeshua. So Satan will make the most of his short time on earth by making war with the quote-unquote rest of her children. Satan failed to destroy the male child, the Messiah. Satan will also fail to destroy the woman Israel during the Great Tribulation, right, as she flees off to this place of refuge. We now read that the focus of Satan during the time of the Great Tribulation will be to destroy the rest of her children. Who are these children? Who are the other children, right? Who are the rest of her children? We know clearly that the woman represents Israel and the child is Messiah. We've put together lots of scriptures in the previous teaching that support this, right? The rest of her children could be those who do not flee, who are still back in Jerusalem or Judea. However, they are clearly defined as those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Yeshua. So the rest of her children are clearly being spoken of as believers in Yeshua. That is clear from the text. Now, another question, is this only referring to Jewish believers, only Gentile believers, or is it referring to Jewish and Gentile believers? There's differences of opinion out there. Those who hold to a strict pre-tribulational perspective believe that these other children can only be Jewish believers in the end times, as explained here by J.B. Smith, who holds this position. He says, quote, consequently, by the rest, one is to understand those Israelites who do not live in Judea. Smith believes that these other children of the woman will only be Jewish believers. And I read his full commentary, and he's clearly talking about Jewish believers at that time. And that fits with the pre-tribulational view because they believe that the Gentile church has been, taken out early. Now, it's my opinion that Revelation 12:17 is speaking of believers in Yeshua in general, Jewish and Gentile. And I would even say it probably is more speaking to Gentile believers, but I think it's both, because in the New Testament we constantly have this understanding of who we are in Messiah, right? And all of us who believe, Jew and Gentile, we're one. And we read that here in Galatians 3:25 to 29. And let me read these verses. Quote, "But now that faith has come, we are no longer under a tutor, for you are all sons of God through faith in Messiah Yeshua. For all of you who are baptized into Messiah have clothed yourselves with Messiah. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free man. There is neither male nor female. For you are all one in Messiah Yeshua. And if you belong to Messiah, then you are Abraham's descendants, heirs according to promise." Right? So in these verses, again, it's emphasizing that all of us who believe, Jew and Gentile, we are one in Messiah, right? Now, we know that in the flesh, we are still male and female. We can still be Jew and Gentile. However, in Messiah, right, we're the same. We're one. And here it's emphasizing that we're all descendants of Abraham, right? We're all of that seed of Abraham. And literally this word here for descendants is the Greek word sperma. And it's actually the same word used in Revelation 12:17 for children, right? It's the children, the seed, the descendants. It's used that same way. But again, it's just important to understand the identity of those in Messiah, right? Jew and Gentile. We're all one. Now, another biblical reason for why I believe that the other children is referring to Jew and Gentile, believers in Yeshua, is Yeshua's own words regarding the quote-unquote other sheep of his flock. And Yeshua said this in John 10:14 to 16. Quote, "I am the good shepherd, and I know my own, and my own know me. Even as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep, which are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will hear my voice, and they will become one flock with one shepherd." Right? So the other sheep, just like the other children, very similar, right? But we're all one in his name. Now, this is actually in agreement with the prophecy in Isaiah, this whole subject of the other sheep. I think it's actually a fulfillment of these verses in Isaiah 56, 7b to 8, where we read, "For my house will be called a house of prayer for all the peoples. The Lord God who gathers the dispersed of Israel declares, yet others I will gather to them, to those already gathered." Right? So the others to be gathered with Israel are peoples of the nations, right? So we see this theme of the other sheep, the other children, the others that are gathered together with God's people, right? With the house of Israel. Another identifier of the rest of her children in Revelation 12:17 is in the verse itself in the book of Revelation, because it describes those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Yeshua. And we read a similar description in Revelation 14:12, where we read, "Here is the perseverance of the saints who keep the commandments of God and their faith in Yeshua." Right? So clearly we see here how the rest of her children is simply talking about the saints, right? It's believers in Yeshua. We know that from the context itself of the verse. But again, we're seeing it consistently, I think, of Jew and Gentile. So I believe Revelation 12 tells us that Satan's end times goal is to make war with Jews and Christians. It's the woman and the rest of her children, right? The woman clearly represents Israel. I think the rest of her children is simply speaking of believers in Yeshua. Satan's target will be on all of those who identify with Israel, the natural Israel and spiritual, right? Jew and Gentile, and it's all of us together. I think we clearly see that throughout the scriptures, and especially here in this context with what we read in Revelation 12. And we have to remember, too, that faith in the Messiah is based on the promises given to Israel, right? We read this again and again in the scriptures, but so often, unfortunately, in the modern Christianity, it becomes this Gentile religion, and it's kind of like, separate from our biblical roots, right? We have to understand that Gentile believers are grafted in to the promises, right? The Jewish believers are the natural branches, Gentile believers are the wild branches, right? But we're all part of that same tree, and we're all one in Messiah. We need to understand the context of the scriptures. So from the perspective of Satan, the Great Tribulation will be an all-out war against Almighty God and against his people, Jew and Gentile, especially against the saints, those who hold to the testimony of Yeshua. Satan fails to destroy, to annihilate, right, the nation of Israel that flees to this place of refuge. And then we see this turning to destroy the saints. That will be Satan's main focus during the end times. It's against the Jew and the Gentile, right? But especially against the saints. We see that again and again. Revelation 12 paints a picture of the spiritual warfare which has been since the beginning and will continue until Messiah's return. But we see that specifically being worked out on the earth in the end times. This war against the people of God in the end times is foretold in the book of Daniel. I just want to read these verses again out of Daniel 7, verse 21, where we read, I kept looking, and that horn was waging war with the saints and overpowering them. And again in verse 25, we read it earlier, but I'll read it again. He will speak out against the Most High and wear down the saints of the Highest One. And he will intend to make alterations in times and in law, and they will be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. We know there is war in heaven. There's always war, and it affects life on earth. When the Great Tribulation begins, there will be no doubt that Satan and his demons are carrying out their plans on earth, specifically against God and his people, Israel, the woman, and the believers in Yeshua, her other children, the saints. Revelation chapter 13 provides more detail of how this war on earth during the Great Tribulation will be targeted against the saints by means of the beast and the false prophet. We have to understand this context of the end times being an all-out war against the people of God, against Jew and Gentile, but particularly against the saints, those who believe in Yeshua. The final 3.5 years before Messiah returns will be the most difficult, especially for believers, for the saints. This is why Yeshua told his disciples in Matthew 24:22, unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. And I think this really summarizes well what we're seeing at the end of Revelation chapter 12 here. There's this warning that Satan will war against the saints like never before during these 3.5 years of the Great Tribulation, right? He fails to annihilate the nation of Israel as they go off to this place of refuge. He will continue to make war with the Jews who are in this world, in the place he's able, but particularly he's going to make war against the saints. This is going to be the main focus of Satan against the Antichrist, against the end times world power at that time. This is the conclusion to this teaching on Revelation chapter 12, verses 13 to 17, the war with the saints. Here are some of the resources I used in my preparation for this teaching. And as always, feel free to share this teaching with others. And we also want to encourage you to give a donation of any amount to Nail the Word Lie on our website. Thank you, and see you again next time.